We have an unidentified flying object.
I'm Jack Oswald, and you're listening.
This is Hudson Hamay, and you're listening to...
I'm Richard C. Hoagland, and you're listening to...
I'm Art Bell, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio Live.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Greetings and welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, we have an awesome show, as we always do, but today we have a super special guest on one of my favorite topics, JFK. And if you don't recall, his anniversary of his death will be coming up in 2 short months. It is celebrated every year, not for his death, but for his life. The irony is right after he died, everyone assumed Oswald did it, and the Warren Commission was right. But Americans now polled about the assassination of JFK. Up to 95% of the Americans polled believed that Oswald did not act alone, as you have seen through several of the top researchers that we've had on the show over the last 5 years, including politicians that had their say in the matter, talking about JFK and other government conspiracies. Tonight we bring you a very special guest. He is an author and researcher, Peter Janney, and we are going to be talking about his new book, Mary's Mosaic, the CIA Conspiracy to Murder John F. Kennedy, Mary Meyer, and Their Vision for World Peace, 3rd edition. Peter, my friend, how you doing?
Good evening, John. Great to be with you and your listeners this evening.
It's a true pleasure to have you on, and like I said, the moment I was pitched you and your book to appear on the show, as soon as I saw those 3 letters, JFK, I just said yes. And the more I got to read about you, read the information about your book. Unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to get a copy of it yet, but I've read everything from the reviews to everything that I could get my hands on, not to mention what was given to me. The more I became intrigued that this is going to be a far better and deeper show than a traditional JFK conspiracy show. So because you have a lot of it embedded in fact as opposed to opinion, and that's what I like about it. So let's go ahead and start with who Mary Meyer was, because that is a name that not very many people would know unless they're you or maybe Jim Mars or somebody who's been deeply studying JFK's life leading up to his assassination, especially during his presidency.
Well, Mary Pinchot Meyer grew up in a very wealthy, progressive, liberal family in New York City. She was born the year that women got the vote in 1920, and she had a very kind of aristocratic upbringing with private schools, went to Vassar College, but she was in a family milieu that really encouraged her self-expression. It was not a repressive upbringing at all. She was really encouraged to go out and find out who she was and what her relationship would be with the world. She also was arguably one of the most beautiful women of an entire generation. So when JFK laid eyes on her for the first time, when she was 15 years old in the winter of 1936 at the Choate Preparatory School in Wallingford, Connecticut, from which he had just graduated from the year before, he was really spellbound by her, and he kept cutting in on her date and kind of causing a little ruckus because he wanted to be around her. The two of them did not initially hit it off romantically. They kept in touch. They traveled in the same social circles when he was at Harvard and she was at Vassar College. But they really didn't come to know each other in any great length until the late 1950s, as Mary divorced her husband, Cord Meyer, who worked for the CIA, And so in the late 1950s, early 1960s, this is when their actual affair, their romantic affair, began to take shape. And over the course of the next 3 years, between 1960 and the time of JFK's death, she became a real ally to him on a number of different levels. Your audience has to remember that JFK, in many respects, was a very wounded man. His relationships with women were terrible. He had no capacity for real emotional intimacy. By today's standards, he would be judged as a sex addict. And with Mary Meyer, that was not the case, because she let him know very early on that she didn't have time for his nonsense, that if he wanted to hang with her, he was going to have to, for lack of a better term, get his shit together and start being in a real relationship. And of course, JFK was very taken with this. He'd never really met a strong, very well-bred woman who was also incredibly beautiful, who he wanted to be with. He'd never met a woman like that, and so he was intrigued, and I think he knew deep down that he was a very troubled, wounded man. So this relationship for him on an emotional level really became what I call a relationship of redemption, where for the first time he was able to be with a woman in various intimate circumstances and really learn what it would mean to be a responsible participant. She also became one of his best allies as he turned away from the Cold War in early 1963 toward world peace. That is what he wanted his legacy to be after the Cuban Missile Crisis in the fall of 1962, where literally the world almost came to an end. Some people call the Cuban Missile Crisis the most dangerous moment in all of human history. And of course, this is why we were really on the brink of nuclear war. Subsequent to what happened then, Khrushchev and Kennedy turned to one another and said, we can never allow this to happen again. We've got to do something very different. And so they started to have a secret relationship beyond the initial knowledge of the CIA or the national security apparatus, where they were collaborating to really start to change things. So in the spring of 1963, at the American University commencement address, you hear JFK give one of the most incredible presidential addresses that any president has ever said. This was a real effort to begin to open the door to help people understand that if they wanted peace, they had to go and look inside themselves. All of us had to go inside and look at ourselves and confront whatever attitudes or things that we were holding on to that would keep us from understanding that the Russian people were people too. They had suffered greatly in World War II, and Kennedy wanted everyone to know that it was time to turn away from this Cold War mentality and come together as one world population. So it was during that speech where Kennedy announced that he was going to pursue a limited arms nuclear treaty with Russia. And that treaty only took 2 months to come together. It was eventually ratified the following September by the United States Senate, but it was done behind the backs of the CIA and the Pentagon. And this, of course, was really a way that indirectly JFK had signed his own death warrant.
I'm glad you actually brought up Khrushchev and Kennedy being allies, because publicly they had to be seen as enemies since it was the height of the Cold War. You also made another very, very important point. The fact that the Cuban Missile Crisis was indeed the world's worst threat we could have ever imagined. Why, people ask? Because the bombs dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki were nowhere near the hydrogen bombs that the Soviets and the Americans had created at the time in the 60s. So if they launched nukes to us, what would we do? We'd launch the nukes across the Black Sea, sitting in Turkey towards the Soviet Union, and there you go. Nuclear holocaust before anyone can understand what really would happen. So you obviously address that because a lot of people don't realize that Khrushchev was one of the people that was really mourning Kennedy's loss when Kennedy was assassinated, as opposed to some people blaming the Soviets, because in fact it wasn't that way. That, I think, was the only one of the few good presidential relations we had with the Soviets during the Cold Era. Would you agree with that?
I would, and as I mentioned earlier, these two world leaders were really coming together. I mean, in the fall of '63, JFK was doing back channel work with Fidel Castro in Cuba. He wanted to rectify that situation and, bring Castro under the umbrella of world peace as well. So these are the kinds of things that really just infuriated the military-industrial complex. Of course, Kennedy was going to end the war in Vietnam. There would have been no war in Vietnam had he been reelected in 1964. He had already, in the fall of 1963, signed something called National Action Memo 263, which called for 1,000 soldiers to be withdrawn before the end of 1963 and the rest to be out by 1965. This was a done deal. I mean, and you have to realize that within 48 hours after he is assassinated, President Johnson completely reverses this National Security Action Memo. And 6 months later, what do we have? We have one of the biggest builds up of war in Southeast Asia that we've ever seen. And then, as we all know, that war just continued to grow and grow and grow, where, there were at one point 500,000 soldiers, U.S. soldiers, in Southeast Asia.
And not only do we have over 50,000 American troops dead for a cause that we shouldn't be sticking our nose in the business, which would have been probably wouldn't have happened at all had JFK lived out his life and lived out his presidency. But on top of that, you have people like Frank Lucas and, of course, a famous movie, American Gangster, based on the true story of how he used to smuggle pure heroin from Southeast Asia using the coffins, not the ceremonial coffins, but the transport coffins of these dead Americans. So you have that on one hand. Some people that I've interviewed, one guy who really is one a straightforward man. It took me years to get him to talk, and he doesn't really like to talk at all. He's one of those hardcore military guys, older gentleman. He served in Vietnam from 66 to 69 as a SEAL, and was talking about, it was just known that the CIA was involved in drug smuggling to fund their ops that were not authorized by the United States. So nonetheless, the entire war was just bad in every sense of the word. It was terrible for all the families destroyed here and there, the villagers there who lost their entire homes and neighbors and the children. I mean, if you see the videos of just this napalm being dropped over there, it's a very, very sad scene. But going back to Johnson, a lot of people implicate him into JFK. What do you say about that?
Well, I think Johnson was part of this conspiracy. Your listeners have to remember that in the fall of 1963, Johnson was being investigated by the U.S. Senate. There were a couple of scandals that involved these people called Billy Saul Estes and Bobby Baker, and it was clear that Johnson had been given payoffs. He was a marked man. He was likely to be indicted and could have conceivably even gone to prison. And there was a hearing being held on some of these allegations on the very day of the assassination. Now, of course, what that meant was they couldn't take Johnson down in the midst of JFK just being assassinated. So that whole investigation was dropped. But it's a very real thing that was taking place, and it was just the tip of the iceberg in terms of who Lyndon Johnson really was. I mean, he was a scoundrel from day one.
That's right. And yet, even a new movie that was just released on Blu-ray and a DVD or whichever other way you buy, I think it's called All the Way In, something like that. It portrays him as a true fighter for the people, but that doesn't show anything that he did wrong. And nobody walking this planet is a Jesus in the sense that they're flawless. Everybody's flawed to some extent. So to portray him without having any flaws whatsoever, especially with what he did, is very, very sad, I'd have to say. Now I'm going to move us back to Mary Meyer, because that again is something that I had not known until I've been researching for tonight's show. How influential would you say, because you already mentioned it, that Kennedy, when she was 15, after he had graduated from that particular school, had already had a crush on her just from seeing her. And I even am looking at a picture of her right now. It's got to be, obviously it's in her adult years. I don't know what year it is exactly, but it's in a good resolution color photograph. And she is stunning, a very stunning woman. So I want to ask you about the influence she had over Kennedy, meaning she wasn't just any of the mistresses, or I hate to use the word bimbo because we do have a lot of women listeners, not to mention this is an international show with 42 countries and counting that have called in or written questions on Twitter or Facebook or all the other two. So I don't want them, the countries that use bimbo in a different word, but nonetheless, she was above most of the women that Kennedy was messing around with behind Jackie's back, right?
Yes, that's absolutely right. And in fact, JFK told his chief advisor, his closest advisor, Kenny O'Donnell, in the fall of '63, that he said to Kenny, look, when I get out of the White House, I really do plan on divorcing Jackie so that I can be with Mary. It was a very serious relationship, and in my book, I discuss how JFK at one point went to his dear friend Charles Bartlett, who was the Washington bureau chief of the Chattanooga Times, and confided to Charlie Bartlett that he was just helplessly in love with Mary. And of course, Bartlett chided him that this was a very dangerous relationship. He knew that, but this was just, really what he was feeling. I think there was a way in which Mary was able to comfort him and get to him in a way that very few people could. You going back to the Cuban Missile Crisis again, you got to remember that after this event, JFK was, he was depressed. He realized the severity of what had, almost taken place. And it was Mary who, really said to him in so many words, Jack, you can't go on this same trajectory, this Cold War trajectory any longer. It'll kill everyone eventually. And what a lot of people don't understand, which I think is really quite intriguing and fascinating, is that Mary was a student of Timothy Leary. She was a big believer that hallucinogenic drugs like LSD and psilocybin could be major change agents for people, particularly people in power, to help them see what the real possibilities of life on this planet could really be about. So I maintain, on the basis of evidence, that in the spring of 1963, JFK and Mary, and JFK was very intrigued by the idea. They did a mild hallucinogenic session with psilocybin, and it was part of the process, I believe, that turned him away even more from the Cold War, and really.
let's remind everybody, for the youngsters, because we have all age ranges of this group, psilocybin is the active drug, the active hallucinogen in mushrooms. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point clear. Continue.
Yes. And it's not the kind of powerful hallucinogen that LSD can be. It's sometimes considered to be a bit milder, although, taken under the right circumstances, it can have a profound impact. This is just, a small anecdote to help your listeners understand that, this is a woman who really had dedicated her life. She was an artist. She was a painter. She wanted to be a better artist, and she was willing to do whatever self-exploration on herself was necessary to improve herself. So this was at a time where a lot of people in Hollywood were using LSD under controlled circumstances. Cary Grant, for instance, was a big proponent of LSD. Henry Luce's wife was also a big proponent of LSD and believed that, Claire believed that it had saved her marriage with Henry. So it's not like this is just, some rogue event that had no relation to anything. JFK knew about hallucinogens. He knew about Tim Leary from Mary, and I think he was curious, and he trusted Mary. So the real point I'm trying to make is that there was in JFK's consciousness a real change, a turning away from the vicissitudes of Cold War and its impact toward really embracing what the possibility of world peace could mean for this planet. And that's why he was on a tear on that trajectory, and really not caring what his national security apparatus, like the CIA and the Pentagon, were thinking or wanting him to do. He had felt betrayed by these people ever since he came into office in 1961, where they led him into the Cuban Bay of Pigs crisis, and of course he would not, follow their lead, and he would not call in the armed services to overthrow Castro, and that became a huge event of which he took complete responsibility for, and the American public loved him for it.
Before we get more into this, I actually want to make a quick comment, then we're going to get to a chat room question. And by the way, as you heard before we went on air, we do have several chat rooms available. First of all, the domestic chat is chat.drjradiolive.com, which SoCal Dan is watching, and my co-host Johnny Webb, usually in London, now touring the States on the East Coast, near you, I believe, Mr. Janney. And nonetheless, he is also monitoring international. But I have a picture of Mary right here smoking a cigarette and smiling. Like I said, she's a very stunning woman. I could picture the two of them having their trip, and him puffing down a Cuban cigar and her with her cigarettes. Nonetheless, we do have a domestic question, so I'm going to turn it over to SoCal Dan.
Hi, Mr. Janney.
Yes, good evening.
Good evening. I see that you're a Princeton man and a real contemporary of the time and the area. Do you also have a personal involvement here? Do you know the families at all?
Well, we haven't got to that, but yes, I know the families very well. My father was a CIA officer, and I grew up with the Meyer family. In fact, one of the Meyer children, during my childhood, he and I were best friends at the time of his accidental death in 1958. So my mother went to college with Mary Meyer at Vassar College, and of course my father and Cord Meyer, Mary's husband, were quite close at the CIA, and I knew Mary very, very well. She was one of the most intriguing adults that I had ever seen in my callow youth, but she made a huge impression upon me.
And you really are connected. We've had several CIA officers, agents, former agents on this program, but you literally have it all wrapped in one, being the son of a CIA officer, being the best friend of a Meyer, whose sister was, of course, one of the greatest influences on our POTUS. And as at the time, really, that was the most powerful man in the world. It could be argued now that the most powerful man in the world is actually Vladimir Putin, having all that money, personal wealth, estimated to be at 200 billion. Not to mention he's owns Russia. And I just, if everyone's been following the Facing documentaries, the Facing series, are very limited on National Geographic. They have Facing Escobar, Facing Saddam, and last night there was the world premiere of Facing Putin. And nonetheless, he will be president, bending the Russian, not Soviet, constitution till 2024 at least. And then he's trying to figure out a way from the next 8 years on how he can continue to do this until he literally goes. Anyhow, now that you brought up your relations and actually knowing Mary, let's put this out there, because I think a lot of people probably don't know this if they haven't researched this topic at all. And I didn't until I was researching you leading up to the show for the last few weeks, that she was killed by an unknown assailant, shot twice. And it's speculated that she was also killed possibly by the same people who conspired to kill JFK to shut her up. What would you say about that? Can you talk about her murder?
Yes, I can talk. I can go on and on about the murder. It's something that I have studied for years. She was murdered less than a year after he was. She was murdered in the fall of 1964, just about 3 weeks after the Warren Commission report came out. And she bought one of the paper book summaries of the Warren Commission and started to look through it and read parts of it and just became enraged. And she realized at that point that not only had there been a conspiracy in Dallas to murder the president, but there was now a second conspiracy of cover-up to keep the American people from understanding what had really taken place. So it was at that time she decided that she was going to go public and, in a sense, tell the world, beginning in Washington, who she was and what her position with John Kennedy was. And, Mary was a very respected social person in Washington. I mean, she came from a very well-to-do family. She was an established painter. She was very well connected socially in Washington. This would be someone that people would listen to. And the people who were perpetrating the Warren Commission upon all of us did not want someone like Mary Meyer coming out and telling the world who she was and what she knew and who she had been in JFK's life. So a decision was made within the highest level of the CIA to take her out. And I think that included her ex-husband, Cord Meyer, who was in on it. Cord never really recovered from Mary leaving him. He was very upset when they were divorced. He became increasingly more alcoholic than he was already, and I think it just infuriated him that she was having an affair with Kennedy, who Cord hated because JFK had spurned him years earlier in a couple of encounters that they had with each other. They didn't like each other. Let's just leave it at that. So Mary had a routine every day. She would paint during the morning and then take a long walk along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal towpath, which is adjacent to Georgetown in Washington. And it was on the towpath that she was shot twice, and that's when Washington's most famous unsolved murder took place October 12, 1964.
And like you said, it's very simple for an assassin. CIA used the mobsters all the time. I mean, there are several ever since the FOIA Act, as lawyers call it, or Freedom of Information Act, came into existence or was passed by the Senate. Essentially, what the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the DEA, all those, alphabet soup agencies had to release documents when they were requested, although they would redact things that were still considered national security. The point is they had to start releasing them. And that's when I first read about that the Cubans or the CIA was trying to get some of the mobsters that were constantly going and running a gambling racket in Havana to assassinate Fidel. Sometimes I think one of them was using a cigar that would blow up, and I guess the mobster feared for his own life that the explosion would be too much, so it didn't go off as planned. But the point was, it just proves that they're easy to use contract hits, and they'll use whatever resources on them. One of the main things they do is, like you said, Mary had a routine, is they follow a person's routine. That way they could figure out when and where is the best place to strike. So let's talk about what bothers you about her murder and where it took place and so on and so forth.
Well, I think what bothers me the most right now is I have spent, the greater part of my adult life trying to get to the bottom of what exactly happened. And I think my analysis in my book is as closest to the real truth that we're ever going to get. And despite all the research and documented information that I've uncovered and put together, the mainstream media won't touch my book. The Washington Post won't review it. The New York Times won't review it. No media venue in Washington, D.C. will have me as their guest and be willing to talk about what happened. I mean, this was a CIA assassination that took place, and when your viewers decide they want to read the book, they will understand how this all went down. I don't want to get into the gory details right now because I don't want to spoil the story for them, but it is. It really rivals any episode of the show Mission Impossible. I think probably a lot of your viewers remember that program with Peter Graves and the Mission Impossible Force, and of course Tom Cruise made movies about Mission Impossible. They had CIA writers in the early stages of that TV program, working, former CIA people working on the scripts to really make the show, percolate, to really make it boil with suspense. And so you see in a TV show like that kind of the framework of how these kinds of things take place. I'll never forget watching that show with my dad, many, many years ago when it was popular.
Yes. And
of course the end of the show came and he chuckled and he just shook his head and he said, "We do it better." And so, over the course of many years, I started to put two and two together in terms of, what my father was actually doing in the world and, what the impact of all of that was. But in my book, I document how my own father was part of the conspiracy to take Mary Meyer out and how that actually went down throughout the day of the murder, to the point where that evening, this guy, James Jesus Angleton, probably one of the most notorious evildoers in recent human history, absconds with her real diary where Mary has kept her secrets about her affair and what she has learned about what took place in Dallas. And, it was absolutely essential for that diary to get back into the hands of the CIA so that no one else could, show the world what really went on.
In the early days of the CIA, really, they were some of the most arrogant, the agency by far. I remember a quote going around was, when in documents, a lot of them, they wrote instead of the agency or Central Intelligence, they use that a lot. They basically said that they just called themselves agency. Agency says this, or Central Intelligence says this. And somebody asked them, I believe somebody within the agency asked them, why don't you put the CIA or the agency? And the response was, do you put the in front of God? This was before, of course, the NSA and a lot of these other agencies that were out. At the time, I believe the ATF was just transitioning from being part of the Treasury Department to become a criminal task force. This is long before the like I said, the National Security Agency, maybe 25 plus, or maybe around that, 25 years or so before the DEA. So nonetheless, this was it. This was the creme de la creme of intelligence and counterintelligence. So a lot of the agencies, what they did is they had to lie to their family members and say, I'm an apple picker, or I work for the Department of Agriculture, this. When did you finally realize that your father was in the CIA?
Well, of course, I grew up with a lot of CIA brats in the 1950s. And basically, by the time we were 10 and 11 and 12, we thought our dads were James Bond. That was the sort of cultural stereotype that was starting to come through. It wasn't really until I got into college that I had just a real awakening as to, not only what the CIA was doing in the world, and particularly in Southeast Asia at that time, but what the hell was my father doing? I mean, on one level, he was a Russian, what they called a Russian analyst. He ran the Office of Current Intelligence at the CIA, but that was only one of his jobs. He had other jobs, I found out, that really did involve some spook stuff. But I didn't find that out until after a great deal more digging, much later on after he died. I mean, he died very young. He wasn't even 60 years old. But, of course, he was actively alcoholic, in my opinion, and very much addicted to nicotine. And his health just dwindled. So he had several heart attacks, the final one, which eventually took him out. But I think that one of the essential things for your listeners to understand is, in the CIA's early days, one of the first things they realized is that they had to control information. And this was when they started to infiltrate the American news media and basically take it over. And then, in 1973, you have CIA Director William Colby saying the following quote, and I'm going to quote it directly: "The CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media." End quote. That was what, he put out at one point. From 1981 to 87, we had CIA Director Bill Casey. At the first meeting of the Reagan administration, Bill Casey said at the meeting, "We'll know," this is a quote, "we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false." This is what this agency was attempting to do.
Disinformation, right?
Complete disinformation to the point of just destroying the historical record. I mean, it's only today, if you think about it, where we are beginning to uncover so many unknown historical events in our country that took place that we never knew about. And that's largely because in one way or another, the CIA have just become propaganda merchants of the late, 20th century. I mean, this is what they did. And of course, this was what the Warren Commission report in 1964 was. It was just the most massive cover-up ever executed upon our country. I mean, even President Nixon in 1972 said, quote, "It was the greatest hoax that has ever been perpetrated." This was a sitting president, even though he's not saying to the public, he's saying it in a meeting which is recorded, and this is on a recording. Okay, so, we have just been lied to in a profound way about what really took place in Dallas, Texas in November 1963. This was the end of America's experiment in democracy.
That's right. And last time we had Robert Morningstar talking about JFK here, he said two things. First of all, of course, Kennedy's three things. Kennedy's obviously flipping around in his grave right now for what the Democratic Party has become. If he was alive today, he sure as heck wouldn't be in the Democratic Party. One, why? Because they killed him. Two, because they are far from democratic as they were. Now, let me ask you this. I want to get as much information before the show wraps up. We're definitely going to have you on again. This is obviously too big of a topic, and I know you have more stuff you could talk about now, because you were friends with Mary's brother, best friends until his untimely death, you said, in 58, and knew Mary herself. And then, of course, I'm assuming you probably went to her funeral?
I didn't go to her funeral. I didn't even know she'd been killed because I was away at boarding school. I came home in the fall of 1964 at Thanksgiving, and the night before Thanksgiving at the dinner table, my mother, just very matter-of-factly said that, Mary had been killed, that she had been murdered. And this is what starts the prologue in my book, in terms of finding out about this and its impact on me that night and, for the rest of my life. I was just bludgeoned by what she told me. I had planned to go out that night and, frolic around with my friends. I went back to my room. I crawled up into the fetal position, and it was the dark night of the soul all over again. I mean, it was just, I was beside myself in terms of taking this in, not knowing why I was feeling the way I was feeling, and, and the impact that it would have on me for the rest of my life. Your listeners have to understand that when I lost my best friend, Michael, in 1958, it was a huge event, life-changing event for me. I had a profound grief reaction about this. And my parents, because I think of their alcoholism, really weren't very able to console me in the way that I needed at that moment. And the only person who could console me was Mary Meyer. I spent a lot of time at the family house after Michael's death, and, there were times where she would hold me and talk to me, and were it not for her presence in my life, I think my life at that point would have been much harder to resolve this and start going forward again. So when she was murdered, I mean, on a soul level, it's like I felt I lost an ally, and I wasn't really sure why. There were just so many things that exploded in my consciousness that night, and it took many, many years to figure it all out.
And of course, you're still researching. Now, I have to yield my next question in lieu of a listener writing a question in the chat, which I think is too important to not talk about. So let me turn it over to SoCal Dan to read it. Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Mr. Janney. This is a text from Joe Hernandez in Reno, Nevada. And he says you mentioned there was a diary and wants to know what happened to it.
Well, that's a very good question. I think the real diary, was ultimately destroyed. Another author before me who I actually befriended and became friends with when he was working on a manuscript for her story back in the early 1990s, he had some real pages out of her diary that he had gotten a hold of. I was never able to see them. This author's name was Leo D'Amour, and he committed suicide in 1995, right at the time when Ben Bradley's memoir came out, where Ben Bradley tells the world that the first he learned about his sister-in-law's death was when my father called him up on the day of the murder. And so I believe that author Leo D'Amour's death was quite suspicious. There's a saying in intelligent circles, and it was a saying that was articulated by the great William Corson, who worked for the CIA but never officially. But he once said, and it's a fascinating quote, he said, "Anyone can commit a murder, but it takes a real expert to commit a suicide."
That's right.
And of course, this is how a lot of people, we get told in the public, well, he committed suicide, or, he wasn't feeling that well, he committed suicide. And it a lot of times it's really code for the fact that there were other circumstances going on in the death, and it was made to look like a suicide. And I believe that there's quite a bit of evidence to point to the fact that this was what happened to author Leo D'Amour in 1995.
A good assassin, or as they would say in Mexico, sicario, or mechanic is sometimes a word used in America. Someone who has a designated target is like exactly like you said. Anybody can commit murder. The key is to not make it known that you were ever there. Make it look like a suicide. That is the best way to do anything. Literally, to absolutely do anything. I'm going to yield my next question again because Johnny Webb, my international co-host, has got something. Go ahead, Johnny.
Well, yeah, I'm looking through it here, and I noticed, Peter, that there's the new book that's come out in its third edition. And so what sort of details do you have that keeps up with that? Do you keep up with the details and reprint?
Well, the recent third edition, which just came out a couple of weeks ago, this edition contains one new chapter that focuses on this mysterious runner on the towpath on the morning of Mary's murder. His name was Lieutenant William L. Mitchell, and he came to police the very next day and said, I think I may have run by this woman, and it had to be fairly close to when she was murdered. And oh, by the way, there was this black guy following her. And it turns out, after pursuing Mr. Mitchell, who had altered his name and was unable to be located at the time the first edition was published in 2012, it turns out that Mr. Mitchell has not been completely forthright about what was going on during his military career. This was a man who supposedly was working at the Pentagon at the time of Mary Meyer's death. But to make a long story short, I spent 2 grueling years going after the United States Army, the National Personnel Records Center, the Defense Finance and Accounting Service, to get Mr. Mitchell's records, which I was entitled to from the Freedom of Information Act. And I had to basically challenge them legally and announce that I was going to sue them, and I was going to win if they didn't turn over his military service record, which they kept saying we don't have it. Now, isn't it interesting that right a couple of days before our lawsuit was going to be filed, the Army Chief Counsel calls up my attorney and says, "Oh, Mr. Bodney, by the way, we found all the material that you're looking for. We're putting it together for you right now." And it was only at this time that me and my research team were able to take this material and disseminate it and really see that Mr. Mitchell clearly had intelligence connections, and that his job on the day of the murder, he was not the assassin, but his job was to help frame this hapless, poor African-American laborer, Ray Crump, who was charged in Mary Meyer's murder. There was never a shred of forensic evidence linking Mr. Crump to the body of Mary Meyer or the crime scene, and yet the United States government was trying to prosecute him to tie this up in a nice, neat little bow and get rid of it. Were it not for the heroic effort of Mr. Crump's attorney, a legendary figure by the name of Dovey Roundtree, who in her own right is just such a star. There's a book about Dovey that I would urge your readers to also take a look at. It's called Justice Older Than the Law. Were it not for this heroic attorney, Dovey Roundtree, I mean, this case would have been closed a long time ago, and there would never have been the questions about it that there are today.
And thank God, because that is the worst, the second worst thing aside from having an assassination happen, is framing it on someone who is completely innocent. Obviously, as we mentioned earlier, a good assassination plan requires you to not be there, to have not been there, making it a suicide. But to pin it on some poor soul who had done nothing wrong in that instance. I'm sure maybe there was a couple flaws, but probably maybe have never even violated the law, and yet to spend time in jail and face life in prison, maybe even the death penalty, that is extremely sad. Now I'm going to go back to your family and your family's connection to Mary Meyer. You said right before Thanksgiving in '64 is when you learned of her death, which is really sad. And the way she died, getting shot twice, was it I believe in the park, wasn't it? Wasn't obviously a random shooting in the park. Now, when did you find out that your father, your own father, member of the Central Intelligence Agency, could have possibly been involved with eliminating her, who, of course, she would have had so many things to tell about JFK?
Well, that really is a sort of pinnacle moment in the book. And as I describe it, I'll go into it here. I was in a dream state one night. This was, I'm deep in the research of this book. I think we're back in 2007, 2008. And I had a very sort of kind of out-of-the-body experience one night in the winter of 2007. And I woke up. It was probably 2 or 3 in the morning. I thought someone was in my bedroom, but I couldn't see anybody. But I felt this presence. And it was at that point that I realized my father's participation. And it came directly from something that Ben Bradley had written in his memoir. Because on the day of the murder, Ben Bradley recounts this story where he says, quote, his friend Wister Janney called him and said, "Ben, are you listening to the radio?" And Ben says, "Wister, why would I be? I'm at work. Why would I be listening to the radio?" And he said, "Well, there's been a shooting down on the canal, and it sounds like it could be Mary. Do you know where Mary is?" And of course, what is my father doing at the CIA, hanging around listening to the radio? I mean, this was complete crap. This was the CIA. This was part of the CIA's orchestration, where at the time he made this call to Bradley, Ray Crump had already been arrested. The police did not know who the body was. She had no identification on her when she was murdered. They did find one of the gloves she was wearing. It had a tag on it that had Meyer etched in on the tag. They had to go through all the phone books in Georgetown to finally figure out by process of elimination that it was this woman, Mary Meyer, and that took place, by 6 o'clock that evening. But my father had tipped Ben Bradley off that afternoon, and then he also called Mary's ex-husband, Cord Meyer, who was in New York that day, to tell him that the job had been done. Now, these are documented phone calls, and that's when I realized that the CIA was controlling this entire operation. As I outline in the book, it was very likely radio controlled on the Chesapeake and Ohio towpath where Mary was walking. She walked into the kill zone, and that's where the event took place. So that really started to spin the grinding gears of my consciousness, where I realized, my God, it's just like Mission Impossible. They left as little to chance as possible, and this was a professional assassination operation, which it was.
Professional hit. We do have a question in the chat. Let me just say one small thing. Of course, it's been proven throughout history there's been a lot of rogue CIA agents, because the CIA's mandate, according to law, is they cannot operate on domestic soil without another domestic agency attached, such as the U.S. Marshals or the FBI. So we see them time and time again doing things in America which shouldn't be happening, but yet it happens all the time. I mean, there's so many incidents that we can link to the CIA. I know another person who was researching the Martin Luther King story, and of course, what does it come back down to? Has a lot of the fingerprints of the CIA. Same thing with the RFK. Same thing. It's just it's really, really sad. Anyhow, let's go to the domestic chat, and then let me check and see, and then we have, of course, an international chat. So go ahead. First, Dan, we'll do it in order.
Mr. Janney, David Lopez from Lansing, Michigan, wants to know if you know anything interesting about Jim Morrison's dad, George Morrison.
I don't. I'm sorry. It's just not a subject matter that I have any real knowledge of.
Thank you very much anyway.
Let's go to Johnny Webb now. Johnny, you with us?
Yeah, sorry guys. Peter, obviously everyone knows that JFK was married to Jackie, but we know there was sort of unfaithfulness going on. But here in England, we hear of people like the famous Marilyn Monroe. But you've mentioned quite a lot about Mary Myers. What really made Mary Myers different for you?
Well, I think what made Mary Meyer special is that JFK knew he was wounded emotionally, and he knew that he had some pretty severe limitations in terms of relationship. And I think with Mary, he saw the possibility, again, I use this term, redemption. He saw the possibility of redemption for himself, where he finally might be able to have a genuine, loving relationship with a romantic partner who he was in love with. And this was part of, her attraction that he was grappling with. And it's interesting that, very early on in 1962, I mean, Ben Bradley writes in another book about how he's at a White House party, and of course Mary and her sister is there, and Ben is, friends with JFK, and they're sort of off in the corner, and he looks at Ben and he casts a glance across the room to Mary, and he says to Ben, "Mary'd be rough to live with, wouldn't she, Ben?" And Ben says something, "Well, yeah, it would take the right guy." But right at that point in 1962, I mean, JFK knows that even though his relationship with Mary is filled with, some conflict, there's a part of him that keeps coming back and wanting to be connected with her, because there is an opportunity for transcendence, a transcendence of his personal limitations into a bigger, wider, more expansive, loving reality of which he's had very little experience with.
No, why would you say Ben Bradley was trying to eliminate Mary's private life? What did you find that sort of unraveled that?
Well, I've always felt that Ben Bradley's role in this whole caper was very, very suspicious. I do think there's a case to be made that Ben Bradley was a tool, that he was beholden to the CIA, and that, in a sense, when Bill Colby, a CIA director, says something like the CIA owns everyone of any significance in the major media,
that's right,
he's talking about people like Ben Bradley. And I know from one of Ben's stepchildren that Ben actually in secret hated the CIA. I think he hated the grip they had on him to one degree or another, and he didn't know what to do about it. So I don't believe that Ben really had any foreknowledge of Mary Meyer's murder, but that after the murder, he was enlisted to play it a certain way, to make it seem like he didn't know anything about the affair, or it had to be Ray Crump, and Ray Crump got away with murder because he didn't get convicted. I mean, these were the kinds of things that Ben Bradley espoused in public. But I think, there was a different story of which we'll really never know for sure. I do know that Ben talked to me 25 years later, after he refused to talk about Mary Meyer's murder with any other reporter or journalist. He did grant me 2 interviews where I could sit and talk to him about this, and I don't think Ben was prepared, for what I was going to write, particularly about him in my book, because he never spoke to me again.
Now, we've gone a couple minutes over, so let me ask you this question. And then let me say, I know that you said the mainstream media has cussed you out, and I'll let you speak in places where you should be. But there has been a huge rise in alternative media. This is why this program has had several politicians, celebrities, and researchers of all types that their books and their work mainstream does not touch. Why? Because 5 corporations literally own every piece of news, newspapers, you name it. It comes down to 5 corporations own anything. But so you're always welcome here. Let me ask you this before we start to wrap. Now that you've really exposed everything, which I think there's going to be more. That's why I wouldn't be surprised if there's a 4th edition. Why do I say that? Because there is always new information when people die, such as when Howard Hunt died and he made a deathbed confession to his son, or for instance when he sued, I believe it was Spotlight magazine, and for libel. And as an attorney, I could tell you this: when you sue someone for defamation, all you have to prove is one element, the truth. That that slander or libel, it's the same thing. They're both defamation. One is written, one is said. And essentially, if you're a private citizen, all you have to do is prove that it was a lie, and your defense is the truth. When he lost that case by failing to prove the truth, one element, that, what does that show you? It's implicit in telling you that he was involved in the JFK assassination plot, and in fact the actual murder. That is what the Spotlight magazine wrote about it. So as these key players continue to die, more information will come out. Now, in the meantime though, do you feel, even though it's been over 50 years, 52 years for that Mary has been dead, what are we going to do to get justice for her? What can we do?
Well, that's a very good point. I have met with one of the chief detectives on the D.C. police force, trying to show him where this guy, Lieutenant Mitchell, was not totally forthcoming in his testimony at the trial. I have written letters to the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office in Washington asking them to consider reopening the case. My sense right now is that there's not enough what I would call moral courage of people in government to commit to the truth. Just very quickly, let me say, I do not believe in conspiracy theories. I work with factual evidence of conspiracy in unsolved crimes or events, the biggest of which is the JFK assassination.
Like Jim Mars. That's what I appreciate the most. Yes.
Yes. And of course, the biggest outlier here for the general public to understand is that Lee Harvey Oswald was an intelligence agent. It's now a documented fact that his defection to Russia was a false defection.
Right.
It was run by the Illusionary Warfare Training Program, which has a base in Nags Head, North Carolina. This is where these people trained to be false defectors. Another CIA contract agent by the name of William Tosh Pumley has signed an affidavit saying that he saw Oswald being trained at this center in the late 1950s. This guy Tosh Pumley is also is held in high regard by people like Senator Gary Hart and Senator John Kerry for his testimony about covert intelligence agencies that were directly involved in the smuggling and distribution of drugs to raise funds for covert military operations against the government of Nicaragua. I mean, these are facts about who Oswald really was. When Senator Richard Schweiker said in the late 1970s, quote, "We don't know what happened in Dallas, but we do know Oswald had intelligence connections. Everywhere you look with him, there are the fingerprints of intelligence." That's a direct quote from a sitting senator where, when we had the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, this is what people that, like Richard Schweiker, who had a certain degree of moral courage, were willing to come out and say publicly. So, the game is really over. I mean, the CIA and parts of the government may want to maintain that Oswald, killed the president, and they're entitled to their opinion, but they are not entitled to their own set of facts. And the real facts in this case only point in one direction. Oswald was a patsy, and he also was working for U.S. intelligence.
That's right. And I'm glad you mentioned the fact that he went to Russia, because he went there on the CIA's dime for
Yes.
information. So,
Yes.
And a lot of people don't understand the importance he had as being an intelligence agent. He wasn't just a laborer, who couldn't find work and this and that. This is why Ruth Baker, I believe, who was best friends with his wife, his Russian wife, has written a book, JFK and Me, talking about what she was able to uncover throughout the relationship she had with both Oswald and his wife, and what she uncovered since then. And this is the scariest part, why she fears for her life, and she really is hidden. Now, unfortunately, we've gone past over the time. I do want to remind everybody that you can purchase Mary's Mosaic on our website. All you have to do is go to drjradiolive.com, hit the books and videos tab, scroll down to Peter Janney, and it'll take you directly to his author's page, where you could see everything else he has to offer. And of course, there's also the website, marysmosaic.net. Now, let me ask you this before I start giving the promotions and the things for everybody. If you have one final statement you want to make to everybody internationally that are listening, remember, people that are believing, non-believing, questioning, and let me make this fact forward, because you said this earlier. You don't believe in conspiracy theories. There is a big difference between conspiracy theories and conspiracies. Conspiracies are fact. A theory, that's all it is. It's a theory. It's speculation. So that's why you focus on facts, and that's what I like about it. But for all those people out there, America, South America, Australia, even South Korea, even China, we had questions from there, Russia, Norway, you name it, UK, what would you have to say to them all?
Well, I think I would say this, that we are living at a very pivotal moment in human history on the planet Earth, and it is incumbent upon all of us to educate ourselves and to not believe always what comes through the mainstream media in any of our countries, but to make the effort to dig deeper, make the effort to do research as planetary citizens. The best offense we have is the pursuit of truth. And if we give that up, life as we know it will be over. If we don't give it up, but embrace our own individual trajectories in terms of understanding what the truth is about anything in our lives or events that are affecting our lives, we need to become informed citizens no matter where we live, and not be led astray by what the powers that be want us to believe.
Very well said. And of course, I do want to thank our guest tonight, Mr. Peter Janney. You are always welcome on the show, and we will definitely talk more about this topic and anything else you have written in your life and uncovered throughout all the work you've done. Now, I do want to, of course, remind everybody, like I said, the only thing you need to remember is the name of the show. That's Dr. J Radio Live, DRJ Radio Live. That is our domain, drjradiolive.com. That is also where you can go and click on the books and videos link and scroll down to all the guests of only the last 2 years. The 3 years before that, we're working to get those up there. Remember, that's where we also archive our shows for free for those who want to see them with some nice eye candy, is on YouTube. So once they make their rounds on our networks, our syndicated networks, and networks that play this a few times, such as Late Night in the Midlands, and which is based in the Midwest, PSN on the East Coast, and Deep Program Radio in the United Kingdom, not to mention the terrestrial stations, as well as, of course, you have tunein.com, we have iTunes, and there's just so many more. Just all you have to do is watch our website. But remember, DRJ Radio Live is the same name for YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, Flickr, Tumblr, Pinterest, all of that. Just remember, every little tab or tablet you see on the website will take you directly to that. That's all you have to remember. Now, of course, let's thank some of our sponsors. Don't forget about the Watcher sets. You have the Watchers deal where you save a lot. The special offer for getting Watchers 10, they'll give you a free Watchers 7, which the two of them alone would be more than the special offer they're offering. But you also get Ellie Marzulli's latest book and a year subscription to their magazine PP&S. Also, don't forget the Exopolitics Institute, where I am an official advisor. You can click on that link click on the banner. Just look for the banners at the bottom of the site. We also have the zoxpro.com/DRJ, where you get a very special deal. If just go on there and see what you get for free just for going through our site versus their main site. And of course, the Resonance Academy by physicist Nassim Harriman, who you will hear on here in the next few weeks. And of course, David Sarita's meditation and products. Those two, as soon as he gives us a nice little banner. But in the meantime, just find his name on the books and videos and click on his link. It'll take you there. Now let's thank our team. I'm going to go from East Coast to West Coast. Normally I'd say in London, but now he's touring the States for a couple weeks. We have Johnny Webb. Then we have Tom Schaefer, who is Johnny Webb is my co-host and also watches for our international chat. We also have Tom Schaefer doing our website and also as well as sound engineer and everything else to make the show happen. We have SoCal Dan and Fausto Perez and of course Stephen Kelly, not to mention we do have Lucian doing research and people that I haven't had time to mention. With that being said, this is Dr.